A bustling town square comes to life in the early hours of morning, the cobblestones still damp from last night's rain. Merchants call out prices in practiced tones, their voices blending into the hum of the crowd. Baskets of apples gleam with a fresh coat of dew, while jars of golden honey catch the light in a way that makes them seem almost precious. The air smells of bread just pulled from the oven and with smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. A fiddler plays at the edge of the square, his bow moving in steady rhythm, the same tune he's played every market day for years. The people move in a gentle chaos, weaving in and out of stalls, exchanging coins, gossip, and the occasional laugh. But within the swirl of color and sound, one figure stands apart, silent, unmoving, almost untethered from the rest of the scene. She does not seem to shop or speak, nor does she glance toward any of the goods on display. Instead, her gaze is fixed forward, and though the crowd flows around her, it never seems to touch her. She wears white stark, startling white that seems to glow against the earth-toned backdrop of the market. It is not the cream or beige of working clothes, nor the faded cotton of an old dress, but something far more deliberate. The hem falls to her ankles, the fabric heavy and formal, with a high lace collar more suited to a wedding or funeral than the dust of a weekday market. Her gloves are immaculate, the sort one wears to protect the hands rather than work with them, and her posture is perfectly still, a contrast to the blurred motion of everyone else. There is a softness to her outline, as if the air around her is faintly distorted, like heat rising from stone. Most unsettling of all is her face, half in shadow, chin lowered, eyes glancing upward toward the camera. Not startled, not curious, but certain, as though she knew she would be seen. And yet, no one else in the image seems aware of her presence at all. The photograph was taken in 1920, at the height of a market day that would have felt no different to those who attended than any other week. It was a time of recovery, the scars of the Great War still fresh but fading into the rhythm of daily life. Markets were the lifeblood of small towns, a place where villagers gathered not just to trade goods, but to trade news, to share stories, and to reassure one another that life was moving forward. There were stalls selling bolts of cloth in bright colors, barrels of cider tapped fresh that morning, and animals penned neatly in corners for buyers to inspect. The fiddler melody threaded through the air like smoke, mingling with the smell of roasted chestnuts and the metallic tang of coins passing from hand to hand. The scene, on the surface, was ordinary, yet captured in that frame was something that made it anything but. The man who took the photograph was not a professional, merely a young shopkeeper's son with a fascination for the new Kodak folding camera. He was known in the town for capturing moments of daily life, children chasing each other through the streets, farmers leading cows to pasture, women balancing baskets of laundry on their hips. He processed his own images in a small darkroom he'd built in the back of his family's grocery store, developing glass plates in trays of chemical baths under a faint red glow. This particular image sat among dozens of others in a shoebox for decades, tucked away in an attic where it gathered dust. The only note scribbled faintly on the back read, "Crowd, livestock pens, bakery stall." There was no mention of the woman in white, no indication that the photographer had noticed her at all. When the photograph finally resurfaced, pulled from that shoebox long after the town had changed and many of its market stalls had fallen silent, it was the single figure that drew the eye. Her clothes were too pristine for the setting, her stance too deliberate, her gaze too fixed. Upon closer inspection, her image appeared slightly softer than the rest, as though her form had not fully committed to being in the same place as everyone else. It was a subtle difference, but once seen, it could not be ignored. The rest of the crowd was caught mid-step, mid-gesture, their outlines sharp against the blur of motion. She, however, seemed almost separate from time, present but not entirely anchored in the moment the camera had captured. And in that detail lay the beginning of the mystery. The first time the photograph was examined closely, the woman in white was barely noticed. The focus was on the familiar, the mayor near the bread stall, the blacksmith's wife carrying a bundle of herbs, the butcher's youngest son chasing after a stray dog. But the second time something shifted. Eyes returned to that one figure standing apart. Her dress, though elegant, was strange for the time. By 1920, Fashion had moved toward looser lines, dropped waists, and lighter fabrics. Yet hers was fitted, formal, and reminiscent of another decade entirely, closer to 1905 in style than the modern post-war look the other women wore. The lace at her throat was intricate, the sleeves long despite the warmth of the day. Even her gloves seemed impractical for shopping, more a symbol of refinement than utility. There was no basket at her feet, no purchase in her hands. She was simply there, and the longer one looked, the more her stillness became unnatural. People in photographs from that era rarely appear perfectly still. Even in posed portraits, the faint tremor of a hand or the subtle sway of the body leaves a blur on the plate. Yet the woman's posture was unshakable. She stood with both feet together, shoulders squared, hands folded neatly before her. The crowd flowed around her in streaks of motion, the man with the sack of flour slung over his back, the child leaning in to whisper to her mother, but none brushed against her. It was as though she existed in a small circle of untouched space, invisible to everyone except the camera lens. That lens, too, seemed to favor her. Light clung to the edges of her form, casting a faint halo that was not seen on any other figure. Whether this was a trick of the sun or something stranger, no one could say. When the image was shown to a handful of surviving locals in the 1960s, reactions were mixed. Some swore they had never seen her before. Others insisted they knew every soul in that marketplace, and she was not one of them. One man, in his late 70s by then, claimed that he did remember a woman in white that day. She had been standing near the linen stall, facing the street, waiting for someone who never arrived. He said she didn't speak, didn't move except to turn her head slightly from time to time, as if scanning the crowd. When asked if she bought anything, he shook his head. "No," he said softly, "and I never saw her leave." His words unsettled the room, for the market was small, and anyone entering or exiting would have been noticed. Historians tried to match her to the town's records. Census lists from 1918 to 1922 were pulled, along with marriage licenses, birth announcements, and obituaries. Not a single name or description matched her appearance. The only clue they found was absence. 2 years after the photograph was taken, in 1922, a seamstress in a nearby village recorded altering a white dress of the same style. The name of the client was smudged and unreadable. Whether the two were connected, no one could prove. It didn't help that a fire in 1925 destroyed part of the town's archives, erasing entire pages of its history. Any trail the woman might have left had been burned away. The absence of evidence made her presence in the photo more haunting. She wasn't smiling like the children or conversing like the vendors. She wasn't moving like the farmers or browsing like the shoppers. She seemed entirely self-contained, like a figure superimposed on another world. And perhaps most unnerving of all, the camera had caught her eyes. In the flat light of a century-old photograph, most faces blur into shadow and grain. But hers were sharp, direct, and locked on the photographer with an intensity that seemed almost deliberate. It was not the gaze of someone caught unaware. It was the gaze of someone who wanted to be seen. To understand who she was, we have to step back into that morning. The day began as it always did on market day, with the sound of the bell ringing through the narrow streets at precisely 9 o'clock. It was a signal as familiar as sunrise, the first wave of traders from nearby villages filing in with their carts, wheels rattling against the cobblestones. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery long before the first loaves were sold, mingling with the sharper smell of horses tied along the square. A stall near the fountain displayed crisp linen sheets, the scent of soap and sun still clinging to them. Each stall had its regulars, and each regular was accounted for. The mayor with his bowler hat, the butcher with his apron already dusted with flour from breakfast, the midwife known for her quick tongue, the blacksmith's family gathered near the feed cellar. Photographs taken by others that day confirmed the same faces. Everyone could be named. Everyone but her. She appeared in only one image, in one moment, standing where no one remembered her standing, wearing clothes no one could place. The memories of that day, pieced together decades later, were as fragile as the photographs themselves. Interview reenactments showed hands turning brittle album pages, fingers pausing on images of laughing children and proud stall owners. In dim light, voices were heard, some uncertain, some firm. An elderly woman recalled the market vividly but swore the woman in white had never been there. Another insisted she would have noticed such a dress. After all, white stood out against the muddy skirts and patched coats of the time. But one voice told a different story. An old man, his voice thin but steady, said he remembered her clearly. She had been near the linen stall, facing the street as though waiting for someone. He said she didn't move much, didn't shop or speak, and seemed untouched by the bustle around her. He remembered the way she would occasionally turn her head, scanning the crowd with an expression he couldn't read. She was there for far too long, he said softly, like she was waiting for someone who never came. When asked how she left, his answer chilled the room. I never saw her go. The absence of her from living memory was strange enough, but the absence from written record was stranger still. The narrator explained the painstaking research that followed. Census lists between 1918 and 1922, marriage licenses from the local parish, birth announcements in the town paper, and obituaries filed in neat columns. Not a single entry matched her face or described clothing like hers. Even her possible origin could not be traced. If she was from a nearby village, no one claimed her. If she was passing through, she left no mark. The search might have gone further if not for a disaster in 1925. A fire in the town archives that destroyed years of records. Marriage registers, property transactions, visitor logs from the inn, all gone in a single night. If the woman's identity had ever been written down, it had been erased in that blaze. The result was a void, and in that void speculation grew. The simplest question proved the hardest to answer. If she wasn't from here, why did she come that day? Was she meeting someone in the market? Was she drawn by an event no one else remembered? Or had she simply wandered in from somewhere else? The more her presence was examined, the less it fit the pattern of ordinary life captured in the photograph. The other faces told stories of routine, people buying, selling, chatting. Hers told nothing. It was as if she had stepped into the market not to take part in it, but to be seen in it, and then vanish without a trace. And in a town where everyone knew everyone, that was perhaps the most unsettling mystery of all. One of the earliest explanations put forward was simple in theory. Perhaps she had been a guest at a wedding that week, stopping at the market before or after the ceremony. White dresses, after all, had been worn for decades by brides, and her attire seemed too fine for everyday wear. If she had come from a neighboring village to attend a marriage, it would explain her unfamiliar face. But the problem was that there were no weddings in the town that week. None in the surrounding villages either, according to the parish records that survived. In 1920, white was not a common color for market attire. Most women chose darker fabrics that could withstand dirt and wear. The style of her dress only deepened the puzzle. A local seamstress, shown the photograph in the 1950s, dismissed the idea that it was modern. She insisted the cut, lacework, and layered skirt belonged to 1905 or earlier, not the sleeker post-war silhouettes. Which meant, as the narrator would say with deliberate pause, she had been dressed in a style that hadn't been seen for 15 years. Another theory was more symbolic, less celebratory. In certain cultures, white was not the color of joy but of mourning. White mourning garments were rare in Europe, but in some places they signified purity and the formal closure of grief. The gloves, the high collar, and her unwavering stillness could be the signs of a widow marking the end of her mourning period. The market might have been her first public appearance after a loss. This would account for her detached demeanor, standing among the crowd but separate from it, like someone still learning how to exist in the world without the person they had lost. But when researchers searched for corresponding obituaries, they found nothing. No recent widow matching her age, no funerals that lined up with the date the photograph was taken. If she was grieving, the trail of her grief had not been recorded. The most enduring theory, and the one that took on a life of its own, came decades later. By the 1970s, when the photograph began to circulate in local folklore, younger townsfolk began calling her the Bride in White. They told a story about a young woman in 1905 who was to be married in the square, but who vanished on the morning of her wedding. Some versions claimed she had been left at the altar. Others whispered of an accident, a fall into the river that ran just beyond the town's edge. In every version, she was said to wander the market, searching for her groom, appearing and disappearing without warning. There was no historical proof for any of this, no record of such a disappearance, no missing persons notice in the newspapers of the time. But the legend grew stronger with every retelling, fueled by one curious detail. The stall where she was seen standing in the photograph was never rented again. The reason, when asked, was always vague. Merchants said the spot was unlucky, or that it was too exposed to the wind. Yet no other open space in the market stayed empty for so long. And of course, there was one other theory, and this one was harder to dismiss. The final explanation belonged not to ghost stories but to the dangerous politics of the era. In 1920, parts of Europe were still unstable, and even small towns could find themselves entangled in the currents of unrest. Smuggling routes passed quietly through rural areas, and markets were a perfect place to exchange information unnoticed. Some suggested that the woman in white had been a courier or a spy, her gloves concealing coded messages or microfilm. Her stillness could have been deliberate, a way to remain visible to her contact without losing her place in the crowd. The white dress might have been a signal, a way to stand out just enough for the right person to find her. But this theory, too, raised its own riddle. If she was engaged in espionage, why allow her photograph to be taken? Why risk leaving behind an image that could be traced? Unless, of course, she never expected the photograph to survive, or never expected to be seen in it at all. The glass plate negative, stored for decades in a locked drawer at the town's historical society, had never been examined under modern technology. When the curators finally placed it beneath a high-resolution scanner, the details came alive in startling clarity. Every brick in the market square, every thread in a merchant's apron. But when the technician adjusted the light balance, something strange appeared. Her outline was faint, almost translucent, as though she were not entirely there. It could have been a trick of exposure, an accident from the cumbersome cameras of the era. Yet there was no second image, no double frame to explain it. Every other figure in the scene was crisp and solid. Only she seemed to exist in that strange, half-faded state. It was as if the camera had caught more than one version of reality. The archivists debated for days whether the anomaly was a flaw or a clue. They sent the scan to a university photography lab, where experts ruled out common photographic errors. There was no evidence of mishandling, no scratches or damage in that section of the plate. One professor remarked that the transparency effect was too clean to be accidental. Theories swirled. Perhaps the light caught her veil at an odd angle, or perhaps she was moving so slowly the exposure barely registered her. But in the image, her hands were perfectly still, her gaze fixed ahead, her stance unwavering. It was not the blurred motion of a passerby. It was a presence that seemed both there and not there, and the more they looked, the more unsettling it became. In 2022, a small research group specializing in historical mysteries decided to try something different. They fed her image into a facial recognition program designed for archival photographs, its database spanning thousands of regional portraits taken between 1880 and 1930. At first, the algorithm produced vague possibilities: women with similar hairstyles, the same oval jawline, comparable brows. But then, one match stood out: an 85% similarity to a young woman photographed in the spring of 1905. That woman was wearing a bridal gown, her expression serene, her future unknowable. The match was far stronger than any other, enough to warrant further digging. The researchers contacted the family descendants listed in the archives. The trail led to a name: Clara Bassett, age 23, engaged to a local merchant. According to surviving accounts, Clara vanished on the morning of her wedding. The last sighting placed her walking alone toward the church, carrying a bouquet of white lilacs. Her disappearance sparked a search that consumed the town for weeks. Divers were sent to the river, barns and fields were combed, letters were intercepted in case of elopement. Nothing surfaced. No body, no trace, no reason. Her fiancé never married, and her family moved away in grief. The 1905 photograph in the archives was the only known image of her. And now, somehow, she had appeared again in 1920 on market day. The logical mind rebels at such a finding. How could a woman who had been missing for 15 years stand in the middle of a busy market, uniged, unrecognized, and unmoving? There were no records of Clara after her disappearance, no rumors of a secret life. And yet, in the photograph, the curve of her cheek, the slope of her nose, the precise tilt of her chin, they all matched perfectly. The software was clear, the resemblance undeniable. For the researchers, it was a revelation and a torment, because with this match came more questions than answers. Was it a case of remarkable coincidence, a stranger with the same features? Or was something far stranger at play? The image of Clara Bassett in the market became an obsession for those who studied it. Some insisted she must have survived, slipping away under a new identity, only to return years later for reasons unknown. But if that were true, why no sign of aging? Why no record of her arrival or departure? Others leaned into darker possibilities, that she was a vision, a fragment of a life cut short, somehow caught in the emulsion of the glass plate. Such ideas strayed into folklore, but the town had always whispered about her, even decades after she vanished. The market stall where she stood in the photograph had remained unused, as though no one wanted to inherit her shadow. In the closing stages of the investigation, the team decided to present their findings in a public exhibition. Visitors could study the enlarged photograph side by side, the 1905 bridal portrait and the 1920 market scene. Most agreed they showed the same woman. Children stared at the white figure and asked if she was a ghost. Elderly locals muttered about curses, old debts, and wedding vows unfulfilled. One man claimed his grandfather had seen her that day, standing as if she'd been waiting for someone who never came, but no witness could say they saw her leave. She simply was there, and then she wasn't. The final image in the exhibition was a slow, digital zoom into her face. Grainy yet graceful, the eyes seemed to hold a question no one could answer. The narrator's voice, soft, almost hesitant, offered the only conclusion that felt honest. Maybe she had been lost, maybe she had been searching, or maybe she had never belonged to our time at all. In the end, her identity remained a void, a silence that no census, no obituary, no ledger could fill. The glass plate negative went back into storage, but the questions it raised never returned to rest. More than a century has passed since market day in 1920. The cobblestones have been replaced, the stalls are long gone, and the square echoes only with tourists' footsteps now. Yet the photograph endures, passed from archivists to historians to curious strangers on the internet. Every few years, someone claims they have solved it. A theory, a family link, a forgotten diary entry. But each time, the evidence dissolves on closer inspection. And so the white figure in the crowd remains as she always has. A moment in time, both frozen and fleeting, belonging to no one, claimed by no story. The woman in white remains unidentified.